Thank you for viewing this recording of our webinar titled Reimagining Our Lives, Cultivating Joy and Self-Care as Acts of Resistance. This webinar is brought to you by the Women's Caucus, an official relationship with the American Public Health Association. The Women's Caucus is committed to providing a forum for uninhibited discussion of emerging, often not considered and/or important issues affecting the lives and health of women. Today's presenter is Dr. Jameta Barlow. She is an assistant professor at the George Washington University.
Thank you for the invitation to be here. I am going to first, let me make sure, I always like to have the video panel over to the side so I can see whoever may have their video on. We're a small enough group that as I'm talking, feel free to just interrupt me and ask questions. This can be more of a conversation. When I was asked to talk about mental health awareness, I first came to this idea of, for self-care. A lot of the work that I do now as a researcher to address intergenerational trauma for Black women has been centered around self-care. And in the last 2 years, for obvious reasons, self-care has been on the tip of everyone's mouth, or their tongue, I should say. And so this is a title called Reimagining Our Lives, Cultivating Joy and Self-Care as Acts of Resistance. So like any other scholar, I'm going to go through and give some references. I'm going to give you some knowledge, share some knowledge, and then give you some reminders, because I do believe that we all know what we need to do to maintain wellness for ourselves. Sometimes we just need a nudge. And so this is just a little bit of who I am and what I do. I do a lot. So self-care is a necessity. I am the past chair of Committee on Women in Psychology for APA and currently a scholar in residence at the Black Women's Health Imperative, as well as the work that I do with RAND and the Council on Black Health. And that's some of my contact information, and I'll share the rest of it at the end. So again, thank you for this warm welcome, and I look forward to our conversation today. The next thing I want to do is just have all of you, sit back in your seat, put your feet down on the floor, and take a moment, maybe close your eyes or avert your gaze. And we're going to start with a little bit of mindfulness. I'm also trained as a yoga instructor, yoga asana instructor, as well as meditation. And so what we're going to do now is allow our breath to just fill our lungs as we inhale and as we exhale. Remembering that you are exactly where you're supposed to be in this moment, in this life, and in this work. Continue to inhale and to exhale. Noticing how your breath fills and escapes. Maybe placing your hand on your belly, another hand on your heart. Noticing your chest and your stomach rising and falling. As you breathe in, breathe into those places where you feel tension. Breathing in all that is good, releasing the tension. Exhaling the tension. Let's take a few more breaths. Inhaling good, exhaling stress. Take one last breath, inhaling and exhaling. And when you're ready, open your eyes, flutter your eyes open. And welcome back. So what I want to do throughout today's talk, that was a very easy, if you're sitting in traffic and you need to just get your life together, you can inhale good, exhale tension. I'll show you some other little tips along the way related to breathing, related to writing that you can do to really center self-care and activate your parasympathetic nervous system and focus on wellness. Whoops, I went the other way. So it's important to remember the land that we're on. I like to remind people there are still 500 nations of indigenous native people present in what is now the Americas. But we have to also remember that, a lot of this work that we do to address the issues in public health stem from colonialism. And colonialism was about this ideology of not only white supremacy, but who worked the land, whose land was stolen, and who benefited from that. And so this is a great resource for those who are interested, but I do like to acknowledge wherever you are in the world, the native land that you are on. I also, in our remembering, like to acknowledge people who were meaningful to me, starting with my oldest known ancestor. Old Belinda is the name that was written on the only document we have related to her in 1731 in Virginia. And so when we're remembering about self-care, what helps me sometimes is acknowledging that I am supposed to be here. I belong here. Sometimes we can find ourselves in spaces where we feel like we don't belong. And I think about, my family history. I think about my grandfather pictured here who voted for the first time before Black people could not vote here in the US. And so the Sankofa bird reminds us to look to the past. So that's my past. I also remember my father telling me that I am evidence of how strong our family is. So that's me looking out from the point of no return in Ghana. And then I think about my very first public health professor, Dr. Bill Jenkins, whom all of you probably know, and how he encouraged me to do this work, but how he also used data to really bring light to the issues that of his time and continue to train so many people just like me. And so I also want to bring into this conversation a dear friend, Kamina Davis, who, again, both of these folks, all too soon. But she was a community health worker in addition to being a faculty member, and really reminded me to put community first. And so what I want to do is leave you with this quote from Sonia Sanchez, because this is what I try to live by, is that I'm constantly learning and growing every day. And I hope that you learn something today, because I know that when I learn something new every day, my worldview expands. And that is, I think, why we're supposed to be here. And so as we're thinking about, following with this Sankofa, this idea of looking to the past, our dearly departed now an ancestor, Bell Hooks, left us with so many pieces of wisdom in her books. And I use this one of many interviews that she had, this phrase from this interview that she used over and over: white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And so one thing I do like to remind people is that I don't care how much self-care you do, that's not going to eliminate what we are experiencing in this world due to white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And we have to acknowledge that, because self-care can help us, but it's not going to eliminate these major structural determinants of health that we have. But when we understand that we can pick which part of the battle we choose to participate in, then it helps us situate our role and what we can do. And so when I'm looking at issues that I experience directly as a part of the system, I'm reminded of this, that I'm just like, you know what, that's not my fight. What is my fight is to make sure I'm healthy, to make sure I'm well, to continue to do the work that I've been called to do. And that's what I want to remind you to do, is to take the words from Sister Bell and see how they operate in your life in these moments that you might feel compelled to really react. Please react. I believe in anger. One of my favorite pieces is by Audre Lorde, where she talks about the uses of anger. Anger can be a good thing, can be a healthy thing, right? But you have to make sure that you don't get off track. And then I like to bring in our Indigenous sister, Kim Tallbear. She's written a lot, and I quote her often in my work. But one thing that she does here, and I wanted to highlight women, since I'm talking to the Women's Caucus, so you have a lot of quotes from women today. I wanted to highlight that even in our fight for who we are, in this case, she's talking about how many people are claiming to be Indigenous, especially now with all the DNA tests that people do. And this has become part of her fight, is that is not often in alignment with what was taught. And so how she's fighting not only against colonialism, but also for her own identity and how that's used. And that's a different kind of fight that is different from, say, acculturation. But this fight for your existence is something that our Indigenous siblings have been experiencing for a very long time, but particularly now, as we're seeing this happen over and over and over. And so with this quote, it's that it's more than just like she said, the core theft of settler colonialism. It's that what happens when these folks say, I'm 2% Indigenous, so therefore I have access to whatever. That's when it can get complicated. And so how do we manage, again, these systems that are there and continue to care for oneself? This is Elizabeth Pear, and she's an attorney and an environmentalist. And it's actually, I didn't realize it was kind of hard to read. But this understanding, I think a lot of times we think about environmental health, people don't realize the work that not only women, I think about ecofeminists, womanists, have done, but how what's happening in the world is often a reflection of what's happening to women, to our bodies, to our spirits, what happened to our ancestors. They are not in isolation. And so she talks a lot, again, about these systems and how it shows up in the environment. And I think it's necessary to bring that up so that we understand that we can be in community across the world with people, understanding that they're also caring for themselves by being activists. That is, in fact, particularly for women, particularly for underrepresented groups, that caring for oneself sometimes is advocating for oneself, advocating for one's community. I bring in Shonda Prescott Weinstein, who has a really good book out now. If you can check her out, I highly recommend it. She's a physicist. But one thing she talks about is this narrative about ourselves, right? When we think about science, no one really questions, like she says here, should white men even be in physics classrooms? Because they were there. I think about our field of public health, nobody questions certain things. But then we will question things about our histories, about why people of color are in the room, right? I think about our new Supreme Court justice and all the questioning that she received and how that was in comparison to some previous, more recent justice hearings or Senate hearings. And so what I like about this quote is that she talks about what is this narrative when we talk about people who were enslaved, right? We talk about, yeah, they went through this is what they were doing, but we talk about it like they weren't smart. Like they weren't people who understood agriculture. They were specifically chosen to be in certain areas. And we know this, right? And so we have to, sometimes caring for ourselves is also taking ownership of the narrative about ourselves, if that's our fight. right? And then I bring in Judy Young, who reminds us and created this discipline for Chinese American women, but Chinese studies. But really, the importance of community, the importance of oral history, and again, taking ownership of our narratives. And that is so essential as we think about what it means to care for oneself. And then I like to think about, this picture was found by a researcher in Georgia. And Stephanie's last name is escaping me right now, but she found it in the archives. And she found this picture of this yogi practicing. She might look a little familiar to you. And this is Rosa Parks. And so yoga isn't for everyone. Meditation isn't for everyone. But it is important to find that thing that brings you joy. And so what I often tell people is that you should make a list of those things that make you feel joyful, those things that make you be free, that help you feel free. And what you do is you sprinkle them throughout your week. So for me, I think about taking daily walks outside. I think about gardening. I think about yoga, meditation, being around friends and family, cooking, reading, travel. Now find ways, all those things that bring you joy, those are some of the things that bring me joy. Sprinkle them throughout your life. Because what happens when you do that, right? Like literally put it on your calendar. Like make sure you don't schedule anything else during that time. And you know what happens? You are starting to live a joy-filled life. Because it's not only an appointment, it then becomes routine, it becomes habitual. And you don't allow anything to get in the way of your joy, in the way of your self-care. And so Rosa Parks and all that she didn't just sit on a bus. I like to always tell people she was one of their best investigators, okay? But she also practiced yoga. And then I like to bring in Toni Morrison. I use this quote all the time because those of us in public health, especially now, we can get distracted, right? Because racism is a distraction. Many of us aren't really here to study racism. Like we're here because we're passionate about perhaps different health issues, different communities. But racism is not often our sole focus. For some people it is. But racism, when you experience it, it's actually a distraction from your purpose, from your walk, whatever you've been called to do, if you feel that that is your calling. And so as a result, you spend all of your time justifying who you are and your identity. You don't need to do that. So sometimes caring for yourself is saying, I know who I am. I don't have to justify it. This is racism. You can name it. You can say what it is, but you don't have to spend all of your effort, all the time doing the work that you want to do because you're fighting that. And so Toni reminded us of that there's always going to be one more thing. There's always going to be one more thing. And then you have to justify, well, this is who I am. Right? Instead of saying what you're doing is wrong. I don't have to prove this. We see the effects of it. We have enough descriptive evidence and explanatory evidence to tell us the effects of racism on our health. And how does that show up, right? We know the psychological impact of trauma. We can think through all the different things related to structural determinants of health, social determinants of health that result in trauma. And some of that is emotional, where a lot of people, I would say, experience it in the last 2 years, having anxiety. If you're like me, you've noticed people have a very short fuse these days. We have enough videos and social media to remind us of that. We also see it in our physical bodies. We know that we have an increase in a lot of chronic health conditions in the last 2 years. One, because people probably weren't going to the doctor, but two, people were also sedentary. And three, what is the impact of stress and anxiety on the body? When you're grieving, when you're concerned about what's going on with the pandemic. Add insecurities about housing, insecurities about money. That can be a challenge. And we know that we're seeing these things across the board, regardless of socioeconomic status, which brings us back to racism, right? And residential segregation and all these other things that we know contribute to the experiences that people, particularly women, are having, because we're doing a lot of the work for families. And even though I'm talking about racial battle fatigue, and in some of the slides you're going to see it focused on race, it's because of intersectionality. I can't separate the work that I do with Black women, so it's going to be there, but it applies to all women. Okay, all women of color particularly. And so another reminder, when it comes to intersectionality, like, rest is not going to eliminate these systems of oppression. I said it earlier, so it's important you make time for rest because you deserve rest. And you should rest like your life depends on it, because it does. And when you make rest a lifestyle, you will discover how essential it is for emotional and mental health. So what are some symptoms of when, I said earlier, kind of like what it looked like, the impact of trauma. So how does it show up in your body when you need rest? Well, how many of you have had brain fog? I know I've had quite a bit of brain fog this year, particularly feel like this is the worst semester for my students, right? My students are having a hard time. Yes, we're back in person. Yes, things are normal. But this generation of students that we're teaching right now, at least the freshmen, they never had a real junior and senior year in person. So a lot of those developmental things that they should have had, they didn't have. And this is weird for them. And so I see that in them. There's fatigue. People are having a hard time still sleeping. People have random aches and pains, right? You might be having nightmares. Your dreams may be off. You might feel yourself withdrawing from others because everything's online. So even though you might be like, well, I'm already at home, working from home, I'm already resting. Are you resting though? What is rest, right? Because rest is turning it all off. And it's hard to do. Meditation helps me turn it off, but I'll admit, even that's hard. Because I'll have this to-do list and I'm like, okay, I need to do this. And I'll stop and I'll write something down, right? So if you're having any of these symptoms, your body might be in need of rest. Because what's going on is this stress of life, whatever's going on in your life, can lead to all of these things, what we call cardiometabolic syndrome. And if you find yourself getting a little pouch, that could be related to cortisol. I know a lot of, especially for women as we age, that can happen. But if you have hypertension, any kind of overweight, obesity, any kind of risk for a stroke or cardiovascular disease, I'm forgetting one, diabetes, some insulin resistance, all of that is related to cortisol in some way. But we can change that by sprinkling joy throughout our lives. And so this is a link, and I can drop it in the chat after. I'm not going to play it, but it's to a video. It's a 5-minute video. I'm not going to play it though. But even though I'm talking about racial trauma, the tips and strategies I give in here are definitely useful. So this is another strategy. So I gave you the breathing exercise at the beginning. I gave you the list of how to sprinkle joy throughout your life. And now this video. So this is a third resource to offer you. And so another way of looking at how we can address our mental health and wellness is to reclaim our culture, right? Rediscover our culture. What does that mean? When you think about ritual and how important that is to who we are, not only as individuals, but as a community. It brings me to the special issue that I co-edited with my sister in public health, LaConte Dill. And we had all of these great articles, but there were two that I want to highlight. And the first one is by Dr. Maddox Wingfield, where she used this dance style from Martinique called ballet. And ballet really was a way of addressing mental health. You take everything to the floor and you release it through the dance. So all of your concerns, all of your stressors, and she writes beautifully about what that looks like, the practice where it originated. And so sometimes when we think about, our history, some of these practices that were intentionally, at least for, I think about Black women who may have a history of enslavement in their families, they were intentionally told and forbidden from using them because they knew that they were powerful, right? And so we found ways to continue ritual. And so we see remnants of not only this dance, but we see remnants of what Dr. Afia Mbilishaka wrote about with psychotherapy. She trains hairdressers to be lay health, mental health workers. So she's a therapist and a hairdresser. And so when you think about those moments of, and she goes through this history of why you just can't let anyone touch your hair, right? And where that comes from spiritually, ancestrally. And so when you start thinking about ritual, I encourage you to think about your family history. What are things that you do in your family that were ritual? Find ways to continue to implement that. These are ways in which we can reclaim ourselves. These are also different rest strategies that I talked about in this article in Mashable. So activities like mindful meditation, yoga practice, walking outside, feeling the sun, affirmations. Another exercise when I do workshops that I have people do is that I have people to write out 7 affirmations. And then you use one each day of the week. And maybe pin it somewhere in your house, something that you'll look at every day, put it in the car. And these are affirmations that are created by you and repeated throughout the week. And journaling, writing is healing is something else I'll talk about shortly. And that is a way for you to release and to let go of what those emotions are. And make meaning of it, because maybe you want to make meaning of it. Sometimes it's okay to let it go and not make meaning of it, but sometimes you do. And so that's what a lot of the work that I do now is called right healing, play on the word right. And it's informed by a lot of other research projects I've done, but these are just a sample of prompts. So I'm giving you even more strategies. Get a journal. And you can, what would happen is that you would get this prompt and I would ask you, when did you fall in love with yourself? And if you haven't, what would it take for you to fall in love with yourself today and every day? And we'd spend about 5 to 7 minutes just free writing, responding to that prompt. And then we discuss it. You can share if you want to, you don't have to. But this is a useful exercise as you're thinking about those areas where you can find ways of understanding what is it, if you're being honest with yourself, what is it that you need? Sometimes we don't ask ourselves what we need, especially as women. We're doing for everyone, but we don't ask ourselves what we need. Another quote I love is by Octavia Butler. And she says, there's nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. What does that mean to you? What are those new suns? How can you incorporate new suns into your life? And then many of you have probably heard about a gratitude journal, right? I remember back in the day, Oprah talked about, let's keep a gratitude journal, all the things we're grateful for. Even my mom in her wisdom, she'll say, look at all the things you have versus the things you don't have, right? And that's a great grounding exercise, writing that down, reviewing it. But I also like this emotion of anger because I don't think women, particularly Black women, get a chance to be angry and that be okay. And it's even more evident. You saw it. I keep coming back to the Supreme Court justice, the Senate hearings. But when we had a recent white male who had a Senate hearing in the last few years, and how he expressed anger at some of the things that he was being accused of versus how the current one that just was became a Supreme Court Justice, KJB, how she reacted. And she knew she couldn't be angry. Right. So I encourage people to keep an angry journal. This is like, you can burn it when you're done if you like to. This is where you put down all the thoughts, get it out. I also like kickboxing. If you're someone who just needs to be physical, kickboxing does it, or just boxing. Get anger out. You don't want anger to manifest. You want to get it out, but it's an important emotion. And a lot of African, indigenous, and even Asian ways of knowing or forms of medicine, they believe if you don't address the emotion, it can turn into a disease. So they don't often say like, oh, you'll have this disease, right? Like in Chinese medicine, they don't say, oh, this is what the disease is. They'll be like, oh, well, there's a blockage because there's this emotional blockage. How can we release it? And so sometimes we just need to release it. There are other ways to release it. I'm also a restorative yoga instructor. And these are some of my favorite positions. So with restorative yoga, and this is a great book by Gail Parker, who's a psychologist. And restorative yoga, you take these positions and you hold them for 10 to 12 minutes. And I know you might be like, oh my gosh, that's a long time. Let me tell you, you might fall asleep. And when that happens, it's my reminder that, you know what, I'm not getting enough rest. And it's okay if it happens. Don't judge yourself if it does. But what you find is that you start to activate your parasympathetic nervous system that allows you to decrease the amount of cortisol in your body. And these are things you can do in your bed. You don't have to be somewhere fancy. You don't have to have a fancy yoga mat. You can use a pillow, a blanket. And what this does is maybe you don't want to breathe. Maybe, I mean, you should breathe, you know, it's a natural thing. Maybe you don't want to do meditation, but this is a great alternative. And you can sit there, turn the TV off or sit in the bed. These are very easy positions to do. And what you would do is hold them for 10 to 12 minutes and maybe do 3 or 4. You don't have to do all of them. But if you can, get this book, great book, highly recommend it. So then I think about restoring, right? So going back to Bell Hooks' quote, I do believe that the biggest threat to white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy is strong women of color, unapologetically joyful. And we know this, history has taught us that whenever particularly Black women, Black people experience any type of agency, exhibit agency. I think about the Red Summer of 1919, which resulted in Rosewood and all kinds of things, including Tulsa, right? Whenever that happens, it's confronted by white supremacy. We see that happening now. And so my answer to a lot of things is, how do we restore to our natural selves of having joy and being filled with joy? And so Linda Goler-Blount is, she runs the Black Women's Health Imperative. And I took this quote from her because I really think it's true. We have to stop thinking of self-care as not just self-care. It needs to be policy, right? When you start to think about having access to paid leave, paid childcare, all of these different things that people are advocating for, that is a form of self-care. How are we taking care of individuals, right? I think that's something that should be explored. This is how we restore, how we operationalize to creating a lifestyle filled with joy and wellness. And so as I want to wrap up and then we can just spend some time talking, I want you to remember to acknowledge and honor the past. That's our way of really understanding all the shoulders and the giants that we're on. I want you to rest. So create whatever boundaries you need in life to rest, to name the trauma, to heal in whatever modality makes sense. Sprinkle a little joy throughout your day. And then movement. I love to dance too, right? And when I say dance, like, you know, tap dance or just dance for fun, but also like after every Zoom call, one thing that I do is I turn my music up really loud and I just, what I call stupid dance. I don't even care how my arms are flailing, what my body's doing. It's a great release. And we have to balance our lives. If we don't, trust me, something happened to you, they'll replace you in a minute. So balance your lives, take care of yourself. And maybe taking care of yourself means being an activist in some way, like all those women that I mentioned earlier. So do that if that is what it means to restore health and wellness for yourself. And then repeat, 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 repeat. These are just some resources that I highly recommend. There's so many. I have some at my website as well that I highly recommend. Whether it's, therapy resources or strategies or apps, these are all really good. I love the Liberate app for meditation, and Therapy for Black Girls has a great podcast. And so I want to leave us with another meditation. It's called 579. If you're old enough to remember, that used to be a store at the mall. That's how I remember it. But we also know that it's been clinically proven to decrease the amount of cortisol in the body over time. And so what you do, if you can work with me, either close your eyes or avert your gaze and breathe in for 5 seconds, hold for 7 seconds, and release for 9 seconds. So we'll do that on our own, a few cycles. We'll do 3. Breathe in for 5 seconds, hold for 7, and release for 9. Do 2 more on your own. And when you're ready, open your eyes. So I left you with so many strategies. That last one is 579. I encourage you to overdose on radical self-care in the Black feminist tradition and make it a lifestyle. These are the ways in which you can get in contact with me. It's been my pleasure chatting and sharing with you.
Thank you for viewing this webinar. Follow the Women's Caucus on our social media sites or visit our website for more information.